The story starts in New York City. Dan is really good at selling cars because he notices small things others might miss. He wins the title of Salesman of the Month again. He likes his simple life and is excited to celebrate his anniversary with his wife, Jessica. They have 3 kids, Kyle, Max, and Na. Kyle and Max argue a lot, which stresses out the family. Dan is annoyed with Kyle always playing video games and wants him to go outside more. Na wants to change her college major because of her boyfriend, which worries Dan. Dan tries to advise his kids, but they don't listen. Kyle secretly plays games at a friend's house, and Na thinks she's old enough to make her own decisions. Dan and Jessica enjoy going to a carnival every year, but Jessica wants more excitement in their lives. After a fun roller coaster ride, Dan promises to make their outings more unpredictable. During a sweet moment when Dan and Jessica kiss, someone takes a picture of them without permission. The person posts the photo online and starts bothering Dan. Things get worse when the person spills a drink on Dan and insults Jessica. Despite the provocation and disrespect, Dan walks away. He hates violence, and Jessica says she didn't want Dan to fight the guys, but she's internally disappointed in her husband. At home, he feels as if he has to hold back. The confrontation doesn't leave his mind. Jessica finds an outlet in boxing, where an accidental punch to her sparring partner leads to an unexpected friendship over smoothies. Opening up to her new friend Gwen, who is also a travel agent, Jessica shares her sense of feeling trapped. She appreciates Dan's qualities as a husband and father but is frustrated by his contentment with their life as it is. While out shopping with Max, Dan's attention is drawn to a suspicious man seemingly watching him. Acting cautiously, Dan is quick to react when the man makes a move to attack, even with Max with him. Dan skillfully manages to fend off the attacker. Advances, neutralizing him with ease. The locals are surprised, and even his neighbors notice something different about Dan. At home, Dan opens up a secret compartment containing guns, outdated passports, and cash. Alarmed, Dan contacts Augie, a former associate, to arrange new identities for his family, indicating they're in danger. Augie suspects the threat comes from Dan's old boss, McCaffrey, and advises Dan to disappear as soon as possible. It turns out Dan is an ex-assassin, a secret he has kept from his family. Most likely, McCaffrey discovered him because of the picture at the carnival. Dan seeks out Na at an editorial meeting, only to discover she quit 3 months ago after a small incentive. Her friend sells her out. He finds Na under the bleachers, upset that she abandoned her dream, but there's no time to dwell on this as they need to collect her brother from the chess club. However, Dan is disappointed to discover him at their neighbor's house together with his gaming setup. Cautious, Dan tells his kids that they are going to Vegas. In the middle of Jessica's work, Dan persuades her to go on a spontaneous trip she desired. Despite her early reservations, she becomes excited and decides to go. But as they are about to leave the parking lot, McCaffrey's men are already waiting. As the bus passes through, Dan skillfully evades the pursuers. A moment later, they catch up to Dan. But he still manages to maneuver around without his family suspecting a thing. Pretty hard to get away when you're being tracked by a satellite. Dan drives into his workplace and closes the gates on the pursuers. He then lifts the car up and finds the tracker, hiding just in time for the pursuers to miss him and his car. The family still has no idea. Dan sticks the tracker on his colleague's car and tells him to give that car a spin on the highway. The pursuers take the bait. With 33 hours to go. While talking with his sister, a stranger recognizes Kyle from his streaming career and asks for a picture. Dan sees Kyle and the girl taking selfies and knows that McCaffrey will be on his tail soon, so he decides to continue driving to avoid being found. McCaffrey hired more men to track Dan, and he notices 3 of them briefly. His family is asleep, and he turns on music on all of their headphones while preparing to use lethal force. His mirror is shot, but he manages to get rid of one, barely managing to avoid a crash and bumping into one of them. His family is still asleep. Honestly, his family is one of the heaviest sleepers I've seen in my life. The third guy just goes flying. After driving all night, Dan finally closes his eyes, but his family is awake. Half a mile away from the college Na wants to attend, she argues her way into seeing it, a gorgeous place with a lot of festivities. Jessica even shows off her keg stand skills, even Na finds it kick-ass. The big part why Na wanted to see the campus is because of her boyfriend Trevor attending this college on a campus tour. Dan spots a German man on his phone and suspects he might be an operative for McCaffrey. However, Dan realizes his mistake when he is unexpectedly attacked by a different individual. They start to fight in the chemistry lab, and after a short scuffle, Dan incapacitates the assailant, rejoining his family shortly after to keep moving. But Na went to see Trevor, she finds him cheating on her. She returns crying, and Dan teaches her a martial arts move that she uses on Trevor, making her feel much better and appreciate her family more. Back on the road, the family bonds even more, and as Na is driving, she thanks Dan for always being there for her and thinks of getting back her editorial position at school. At a small motel, parents finally let off some steam. Jessica is in love with the spontaneous Dan. She feels that something is different about him. Dan calls up Augie, who is on his way to deliver the new identities to Dan and his family. The only problem is that he hasn't told them yet. He then sneakily returns the phone he stole and tries to prepare himself for the conversation. Kyle joins him, and they finally talk about him being a streamer. It's something he's good at, like pro-level good. He wants to prove it over laser tag with Dan. They bet on it, first to 3 kills. This should be a breeze for Dan, being an ex-assassin and all. He gets the first tag in the second, then Kyle retaliates with 2 of his own. But Dan gets the last one. Kyle feels conned, but the two grow closer. Finally arriving in Las Vegas, they are staying at one of the top suites.